She was lying in the ditch beside the Trans-Canada, half buried in the snow, and if I hadn't taken the old highway that night because the 401 was backed up past Brockville, I never would have seen her. I pulled over so fast my rear tires hit the gravel. I didn't think. I just ran. She was conscious, barely. Her lips were cracked and she was shaking so hard I could hear her teeth. I got my coat around her and she grabbed my wrist with both hands, and the look in her eyes, not just pain, something else. Something like relief that turned immediately into fear. "Don't call him," she whispered, "please. Don't call my husband." That was the moment everything I thought I knew about my son fell apart. I want to go back a little. Not because the story starts there, but because you need to understand who I was before that night on the highway. I was 63 years old, and I had spent most of those years being careful. Careful with money, careful with words, careful with other people's business. My husband Glenn passed 8 years ago from a heart attack that came out of nowhere on a Tuesday morning. And after that, I learned to be even more careful, because the world had shown me it could take things without warning. I lived in the same house outside Kingston, Ontario that Glenn and I had bought in 1987. A brick bungalow on 2 acres with a woodlot in the back that flooded every spring. My son, I'll call him my son because that's who he is, had grown up in that house. He had learned to drive in the laneway. He had done his homework at the kitchen table under the hanging light that still flickered sometimes when the wind was strong. His name is not important for right now. What's important is that he was 34 and that he had married a woman named Tessa 2 years before that night on the highway. I liked Tessa from the beginning. That was not something I said easily. I had met 1 or 2 of my son's girlfriends over the years and had kept my mouth shut the way mothers do when they can see something won't last. But Tessa was different. She had this way of listening to you, really listening, not waiting for her turn to speak, and she laughed at my terrible jokes, which Glenn used to say was the true test of character. She grew up in Sudbury. Her father had worked at the Inco smelter for 30 years, and her mother ran a small alteration shop out of their home. They were quiet, working people, good people. I knew it the first time I met them at the engagement dinner, the way they looked at their daughter, like she was something they had managed to protect from the world, and were only now carefully releasing. My son's mother-in-law, I'll call her Doris, was the one who frightened me from the start, though I told myself I was being unfair. Doris was not Tessa's mother. Doris was the woman Tessa's father had married when Tessa was 15. After Tessa's mother was killed in a car accident on Highway 17, Doris had moved into their house in Sudbury and had spent the next decade making Tessa feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I didn't know any of this at first. Tessa didn't talk about it. She had that particular quietness that people carry when they've been taught their feelings are an inconvenience. I found out slowly. A comment here, a flinch there. The way Tessa would go still when Doris called. The way she'd apologize for things that weren't her fault. Doris had this surface sweetness that fooled everyone. She brought Nanaimo bars to every gathering. She called me Hon. She had a laugh like a screen door, loud and present and impossible to ignore. But underneath it there was something that watched, something that calculated. I noticed how she spoke to Tessa when she thought no one was listening, these small precise cuts disguised as concern. "You look tired, sweetheart. Are you sure you're managing everything all right? That dress is lovely, though I remember you mentioning you wanted to lose a few pounds before the wedding. Things that couldn't be called cruel if you repeated them, but that worked on you the way water works on stone." My son didn't see it, or he saw it and looked away. That distinction matters more than I used to think. Tessa got pregnant in the spring of their 2nd year of marriage. She told me before she told almost anyone else, sitting in my kitchen while the kettle boiled, and her face had that particular glow that I recognized from my own pregnancy and have never been able to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. We cried a little and laughed a little, and I told her about the time I was pregnant with her husband and craved nothing but Tim Hortons breakfast sandwiches for 4 months straight. We were building something that afternoon, I realize now. Something that Doris would spend the next year methodically tearing down. The pregnancy ended at 11 weeks. Tessa called me the night it happened from the hospital. My son was there with her, but she called me. I drove to Kingston General at 2 in the morning, and sat with her until almost dawn while my son slept in the chair beside her. She didn't cry much. She just held my hand and stared at the ceiling and said, "Once Doris told me I was too stressed, that I needed to slow down or something would go wrong." And then she went quiet again, and I let her be quiet, but I filed that away somewhere. The miscarriage changed things, changed Tessa, changed my son, changed the shape of what their marriage would become. My son pulled inward the way men sometimes do with grief, going quiet and practical, fixing things around the house, working longer hours. Tessa needed something different than what he was giving her, and she didn't know how to ask, and he didn't know how to offer. Into that gap, Doris moved. It started with visits. Doris would drive down from Sudbury, 6 hours, which she presented as no trouble at all, and stay for a week. She took Tessa to appointments, brought groceries, reorganized the kitchen in a way that had nothing to do with how Tessa used it. She was indispensable, and she made sure Tessa knew it. She also began talking to my son. When Tessa was resting, I only know what he told me later, in pieces, and I had to hold myself very still when he told me because I knew that what Doris had been doing in those conversations was architecture. She was building a version of Tessa, fragile, overwhelmed, unable to cope, that would serve Doris's purposes. My son started calling less. When I called him, he was distracted. He said Tessa wasn't feeling well, that she needed quiet, that they were managing. I asked if I could come down and he said Doris was there, they had it covered. I told my sister about it. My sister's name is Agnes, and she is 4 years younger than me and smarter in the ways that matter. She is a retired social worker who spent 31 years in family services in Guelph, and she has a particular ability to look at a situation without the softening that love applies. "You need to keep a record," Agnes said. "Everything Doris says, everything that happens. Dates and times." "I'm not sure I'm not imagining things," I said. "You're not," she said. I started keeping notes in the back of a small notebook I bought at the Pharma Plus in town. It felt strange, like I was surveilling my own family, but it also felt necessary in a way I couldn't fully explain to myself. The months that followed were the loneliest of my life since Glenn died. My son had always been close to me, not in an unhealthy way, just in the normal way of people who have shared a life. We talked every few days. I knew what was happening in his life. And then gradually, without any single thing I could point to, that stopped. The calls got shorter, then less frequent. When I visited, Doris was often there, and the conversation stayed in the shallow water, nothing below the surface. Tessa would catch my eye sometimes across the room, and I would see something in her face that I can only describe as apology. I found out later that Doris had been telling my son that I was interfering, that I had opinions about their marriage, that I had said things about Tessa that Tessa had found hurtful. None of it was true, but Doris had been specific and consistent, and when you hear the same story from someone who seems to love you and seems to be on your side, you start to believe it whether you want to or not. My son believed it. That is the thing I have had to learn to carry. It was November when I found Tessa in the ditch. I had been to my cousin's retirement party in Ottawa and was driving back late because I had stayed longer than I planned. It was a clear night, cold, maybe -8, and I was on the old 2-lane highway west of Gananoque because there'd been a collision on the 401 near Brockville and traffic was stopped. I had the radio on. I almost missed her. I got my coat around her and got her to my car and put the heat on full. She was disoriented, not just from the cold, but from something else. Her right arm was cradled against her chest. Later, I would find out it was fractured just above the wrist. "What happened?" I asked her. "Tessa, what happened?" She looked at me for a long moment like she was deciding how much I could bear. "I was in Doris's car," she said. "We had a fight." She stopped and told me to get out. It was -8. Tessa had been walking for over an hour before I found her. She had no phone. Doris had taken it before stopping the car. She had been trying to reach a farmhouse she could see in the distance, but the ditch was deeper than she realized, and she had fallen and couldn't get her footing. I want to be clear about something. I drove Tessa to Kingston General, not because it was the closest, but because I knew the emergency department there. I knew it because that is where Glenn had died, and I had memorized that building in my grief, the way you memorize the face of the last person who really knew you. I stayed with Tessa for 5 hours. When the doctor told her the arm was fractured, she cried for the first time, not about the arm. She told him I was unstable, Tessa said. She's been telling him for a year that I was a danger to myself, that I couldn't be trusted. She went through my phone. She showed him texts that weren't. They were out of context, or she added things. I don't know how she did it. But he believes her. He believes her over me. My son didn't come to the hospital. I called him myself from the waiting room, and he said he knew where Tessa was, that Doris had told him what happened, that Tessa had been having episodes and had run from the car in a state, and that he was sorry I was involved. I stood in that waiting room holding my phone, and I thought of my mother, which was not something I expected. My mother was a quiet woman who had survived a first marriage that no one in our family talked about directly, and she had raised Agnes and me with a particular saying that she applied to any situation that required action. She said, "The ones who tell you to stay still are the ones who need you moving." I called Agnes from the parking lot. "It's time," I said. She knew what I meant. She had been waiting for this call. Agnes had contacts. 31 years in family services means you know people in hospitals, in law offices, in social work departments, in the kind of organizations that specialize in exactly what had been done to Tessa. The next morning she drove up from Guelph and we sat at my kitchen table and we made a plan. The first thing we needed was documentation. Agnes helped Tessa write out a timeline, everything Doris had said, everything Doris had done going back to the year before. Tessa's memory was extraordinary once she started talking. Dates, words, the specific way Dorothy's had framed things. We cross-referenced with my notebook. There were things that lined up, things said to me and things said to Tessa on the same days, and seeing them side by side on my kitchen table was something I will not forget. The second thing we needed was a lawyer. Agnes knew someone in Kingston, a woman who worked in family law and also did elder abuse cases. I'm not going to name her here except to say she was exactly the right person in exactly the right moment. She met with Tessa for 2 hours and came out of that meeting with a list of things that needed to happen. The third thing was Tessa's financial situation, which turned out to be more serious than I had known. Doris had, over the preceding year, been steering Tessa and my son toward financial decisions that centralized control. There was a joint account that Doris had access to. I still don't know exactly how that happened, and several transactions in the months before November that Tessa hadn't fully understood at the time. The lawyer flagged this for a forensic accountant she knew. In Ontario, financial abuse within intimate relationships and extended family structures is taken seriously, and the documentation we brought to that accountant resulted in a report that the lawyer used later in ways that I will describe. My son did not contact me for 3 weeks. Doris, I found out later, had told him that I had decided to take Tessa's side against him, that I had always interfered, that I was toxic to their marriage, and this was proof. She was efficient, I have to give her that. She was a woman who had spent 20 years studying how to neutralize threats to her control, and I was, from her perspective, a significant threat. What Doris did not know was that Tessa had a brother. Tessa's brother's name was Lawrence. He had grown up in the same house in Sudbury, had watched the same things happen to his sister after their father married Doris, and had spent years quietly keeping track in the way that siblings sometimes do. He lived in Thunder Bay now, and he drove down without telling anyone, just showed up at my door on a Wednesday afternoon with a file folder and a hard drive and a look on his face that I recognized from Agnes. The look of someone who has been waiting a long time to be allowed to do something. Lawrence had emails. He had voicemails that Doris had left on his phone over the years, checking in, keeping him informed, with that same surface sweetness, and several of them contained things that were useful in context, things that sounded innocuous alone but formed a pattern when lined up with everything else we had. He also had a conversation he had recorded, legally under Ontario law, at a family gathering 2 years earlier, where Doris had described to a relative how she intended to manage Tessa's relationship with my son. She'd used the word manage. It was 9 minutes long and we listened to it twice at my kitchen table with Agnes and Tessa. Tessa held my hand through most of it. Afterward, she was very quiet for a moment and then she said, "I thought I was going crazy. I really thought it was me." "It was never you," I said. "My son came over in early December. He came without Doris, which was the first encouraging sign, and he looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, which he probably hadn't." He sat at my kitchen table, the same hanging light, And he told me that things at home had been hard, that Doris had said things about me that he had believed and was now not sure about, that Tessa had left and he didn't know what to do. I told him to listen, and then I told him everything. I did not do it with anger. I want to be honest about that because it would be easier to say I was righteous and clear, but mostly I was tired and sad, and I still loved my son the way I had loved him when he was learning to drive in our laneway. I told him what had been done to his wife. I showed him the notebook and the timeline, and I played him 40 seconds of Lawrence's recording. I watched his face change. He cried. Not immediately. Men of his generation have a lag, a moment where they're deciding whether they're allowed to. But then he did cry, and I put my hand on his back the way I had when he was small, and I let him. I believed her, he said. I know, I said. She was very good at what she did. He asked if Tessa would see him. I said I didn't know. That was Tessa's decision, and that he needed to understand it might take a long time and require more than an apology. He nodded. He understood. What happened with Doris happened over several months, and I won't compress it dishonestly. The lawyer sent a formal letter on Tessa's behalf regarding the financial irregularities. The forensic accountant's report was thorough, and the conclusion was that approximately $18,000 had moved through accounts in ways that couldn't be explained by normal transaction patterns. Doris's lawyer responded aggressively at first, then less aggressively, then not at all. There was a settlement. I was not party to the specific numbers, and it's not my information to share, but the financial access Doris had maintained was severed completely. Tessa's father, once he understood what had happened, really understood it, with Lawrence sitting beside him at his kitchen table in Sudbury, was devastated in the way that quiet men are when they realize they have allowed something while looking elsewhere. He apologized to Tessa. He apologized to my son. He told Doris to leave the house and that he would be speaking to a lawyer himself. He was 71 years old, and he looked, when Lawrence called to tell me, like a man who had woken up somewhere he didn't recognize. Tessa and my son went to counseling, not just together but separately, which the counselor said was important and which I think was right. They were working through different things. My son was working through guilt and the particular shame of realizing you'd been used against someone you loved. Tessa was working through years of systematic undermining that had made her doubt her own perceptions. That takes longer. That takes a different kind of patience than the anger stage does. By February, Tessa was back home. Not because everything was fixed. She would be the first to tell you it wasn't. But because my son had done the right things in the right order without being asked twice. And because Tessa had enough history with him to know the difference between a man who understood what he'd done and one who was only sorry he'd been caught. On a Sunday in March, they came for dinner. It was the first time we had all three been around that kitchen table since before the miscarriage, and I made the same roast I always made, and the flickering light flickered twice, and my son looked up at it and said, "We should really fix that." "Your father kept saying the same thing," I told him. Tessa laughed. Just a small laugh, not the kind that fills a room, but it was real, and it was hers, and it was the best thing I had heard in longer than I could say. I had called Agnes that morning, just to tell her we had done it, all of it, the way our mother would have wanted us to. Agnes said, "Of course we did, we're her daughters." And she was right, we were. Some things were broken and would stay that way. The 18 months we lost, the pregnancy before this one. Tessa was pregnant again 12 weeks, and I was not celebrating yet because I was still learning how to be careful with hope. The relationship between Mice and his father-in-law would take years. The shape of the family we had thought we were building had changed, and the new shape was unfamiliar and slightly lopsided and would need time to settle. But we were around the table. The light was flickering. Tessa was telling a story about her office's Christmas party that had gone sideways in a way that had nothing to do with anyone in this family. And she was laughing at the part she was telling, really laughing. And my son was watching her laugh with a look on his face that I remembered from before all of it. I got up to check the roast so they wouldn't see my face. The people who love you are the ones who stay in the room when it costs them something. Glenn knew that. My mother knew it. Agnes has always known it. I am 63 years old and I am still learning it, and I think that is all right. I think you are allowed to keep learning the things that matter most, for as long as you are alive to learn them. Take care of the people at your table. They are the only treasure that doesn't depreciate.